Imagine a love so deep, so visceral, that it refuses to be erased, not by time, not by death, not by oblivion. What if this love, which you believed buried deep in your memory, returned? Not as a memory, but as a presence. Not to console, but to demand. What if a shadow appeared in your life today, demanding that you remember what you promised to forget? This isn't just a story of lost romance. It's a dark whisper of a love that refused to die, spanning decades to reunite with the one who once abandoned it. Have you ever loved someone so intensely that, upon losing them, something inside you simply ceased to exist? William did. And he went on with his life as so many do, silencing memories, feigning resilience, piling commitments on top of unresolved feelings. But what happens when forgotten love refuses to accept oblivion? When does absence become presence? This is the story of a memory that didn't just return, it demanded to be heard. And when that happens, there's no moving forward without first facing what was left behind. This story will stir your deepest emotions. It will remind you of those you've tried to forget. It will touch places you might have buried along with someone you loved. And the big question that lingers like a whisper in the dark is, can true love truly be forgotten? Or does it just slumber, waiting for the right moment to return and transform everything? What happens when the past no longer accepts silence? What if what you thought was just longing was actually a calling? Prepare to immerse yourself in an intense philosophical and emotionally disturbing narrative where time doesn't heal everything. It only stores what you didn't have the courage to feel. And now, it's time to feel. Are you ready? It was an ordinary afternoon in a city forgotten by maps and memories. The kind of day when the wind blows slowly, carrying leaves and stories no one tells anymore. The protagonist, a man with an introspective expression and eyes that carried the weight of a life he couldn't explain, was rummaging through old things in the attic of his grandparents' house on the outskirts of Virginia. Among the stacked boxes, a yellowed envelope fell to the floor as if begging to be noticed. Inside was a faded photograph, an old image, almost faceless, but with eyes that seemed to recognize him. There was no name, no date, just that fixed gaze that aroused something between fear and tenderness, a tightness in his chest, a sense of loss he hadn't known existed. And in that moment, without understanding why, he felt that the photo was of him, or perhaps of him with someone. A love? A secret? An unpaid debt? The image seemed alive, as if it held a story it was tired of, waiting for. That was where the restlessness began. And as often happens, everything that transforms us begins with something small: a photograph, a detail, a spark dot. In the following nights, curiosity turned to insomnia. He searched through drawers, albums, digital files, but nothing indicated who the figure in the photo was. No family, no friends, no records. It was as if the entire world had erased that existence except him. And it consumed him. The woman's face in the image was vaguely familiar, but the memory slipped away like sand through his fingers. Was it a delusion of a weary mind, or a memory repressed by something much deeper? It was like facing the reflection of an alternate life where empathy, affection, and the courage to remember were blocked by the instinct for emotional survival. In a world where so many people struggle with self-forgetfulness, this man now faced the opposite, the memory of someone the world told them to forget. And ironically, it was this absence that made him feel most alive. As if true love, even buried, still had the power to generate emotion, hope, and reconnection. Something had been lost. But what? He began to carry the photo folded in his coat pocket, not as someone carrying longing, but as someone carrying an enigma. Every face on the street, every song on the radio, every strange scent on the subway seemed to echo this silent presence. And over time, he began to notice something even more unsettling. Certain moments of the day were accompanied by an almost physical sensation of being watched, not with malice, but with melancholy. It was as if someone were waiting for him on the other side of memory. And this feeling, so intimate, began to undermine his logic, his reason, his very sense of self. How could he trust his own story if there were hidden chapters? How could he trust his own memory if it chose to erase something the heart still recognizes? Fear began to mix with compassion. Insecurity gave way to initiative. And he understood. Sometimes to move forward, you have to stop pretending there's nothing behind you. The shadow that was forming was perhaps the beginning of a reunion or a confrontation. And time isn't usually kind to those who postpone the truth. Over the next few nights, something began to shift in the air, almost imperceptible, but present like the hum of a memory that refuses to die. William began to hear small sounds when he was alone. A muffled whisper, the creaking of a floorboard. He knew well but shouldn't move on its own. It wasn't fear, exactly, it was a strange form of intimacy. Like when we sense something is about to be revealed, and at the same time, we're not sure we want to know. The photograph now felt like a portal. It opened not only memories, but also doors William believed had been locked for a long time. And memories, once vague, began to emerge like flashes, a faint laugh in a wheat field, a touch on the shoulder in the rain, a sweet scent that returned without explanation. He began to write everything down in an old notebook, hoping to organize the chaos. But chaos, when it comes from the past, doesn't accept order so easily. This is where wisdom comes in, understanding that reconciling with what we were requires more than logic. It requires kindness, empathy, and the humility to listen even to what we don't want to hear. One of those sleepless nights, William woke with a distinct sensation that someone had spoken his name. It wasn't a dream. He felt the vibration of the sound in his chest. He jumped up, startled, ran through the entire house, opened cabinets, pulled back curtains, peeked out the window. Nothing. But the silence wasn't the same. It was charged. As if he'd been watched the entire time by a hungry memory. From that moment on, the phenomena intensified. Photographs on the bookshelf turned over. The bathroom mirror fogged with words that disappeared before he could read them. A pen that rolled on its own. It was as if the past were trying to write its own story using his life as paper. He tried to rationalize. He sought help, read about trauma, sleepwalking, auditory hallucinations. But something inside him told him it wasn't just that. It was as if that shadow, that presence, didn't want to scare him. She wanted to be heard. And perhaps understood. There is no connection more powerful than feeling that something or someone truly wants to be seen. And that begins with listening. Listening with the heart, with respect, with the courage of someone who knows that remembering hurts, but ignoring destroys. The tension reached its peak when William, looking in the mirror, saw something that paralyzed him. For a brief moment, the reflection didn't mirror him. There was a second's difference, small but disturbing. The shadow appeared for the first time clearly. Behind him, a feminine silhouette, translucent, motionless, with the same gaze as in the photograph. It wasn't a nightmare. It was the incarnate presence of memory. And in place of terror, something unexpected. A lump in the throat, a sudden urge to cry, a sense of reunion. The brain screamed danger, but the heart recognized it. And that was when everything changed. Because this wasn't just a supernatural manifestation. It was an emotion accumulated over years. A longing that refused to die. A forgotten promise demanding its existence. How many times in life do we ignore our own emotional ghosts? How many times do we treat what we feel as illusion, when in fact they are cries for help from the soul? William knew he needed to face it, not to escape, but to understand. Because sometimes what scares us most isn't what's out there, It's what still lives inside us, waiting for redemption. That same night, without knowing why, William decided not to run anymore. He turned off the lights in the house, lit a single candle, and sat on the living room floor in absolute silence, as if making a date with the inevitable. He didn't call it courage, but necessity. Something inside him begged for reconciliation. It was then that the temperature of the room suddenly dropped. The candle flame flickered with a presence unseen but felt dense, charged with interrupted affection. Gradually, a figure began to form in the gloom, not like a cinematic ghost, but like a memory finally taking shape. It was her, the woman in the photograph. Her face held both sweetness and pain, like someone who had loved deeply and been accidentally forgotten. William remained motionless. Fear gave way to something stronger, emotion. A part of him wept without knowing why, as if his soul recognized what his mind still denied. And in that moment, a certainty took shape. That shadow was not an enemy. It was the echo of a love struggling not to disappear forever. She didn't speak, but William understood. The images came like waves, not with absolute clarity, but with devastating emotional force. A park bench, promises exchanged at dusk, a hurried goodbye, an unread letter. It was like watching a movie inside his own chest. And suddenly, a flashback pierced him like a lightning bolt. The separation. An accident. A hospital. A guilt he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten to even forget. And the shadow? It wasn't a punishment, but a call. A plea for recognition. A vivid memory that refused to be silenced. William fell to his knees, overcome by a whirlwind of emotions. His heart beat, as if recognizing an ancient rhythm lost in time. And that's where emotional intelligence comes in, knowing how to embrace even what hurts, even what seems irrational, even what the world calls weakness, but which, in truth, is the source of true strength, honesty with what we feel. Shadow before him, William spoke. He didn't just ask for forgiveness, he allowed himself to feel. He spoke of the longing, the pain, the confusion he'd carried for years without knowing its origin. He spoke with respect, with vulnerability, and with a hope he hadn't even known still existed. The shadow, in turn, approached and touched his shoulder. It wasn't cold, it was affection, an affection that transcended logic. And when he closed his eyes, he saw something surprising. The best moments, the laughter, the touches, the silent conversations that only exist between two beings who truly loved each other. It was as if the past was saying, "I'm still here, waiting for you to return." But return to where? William didn't yet know. He only knew that from then on, everything would be different. Because when we confront darkness with compassion, it doesn't swallow us. She transforms. And that's rare. It's precious. It's the kind of reconnection that changes the course of an entire life. And William, even without all the answers, was no longer the same. And neither was the shadow. After the encounter, William woke up with tired eyes, but his soul awakened. The house seemed the same, but he was no longer the same man. There was something different in the way he breathed, the way he looked at the details of life, as if every object around him held a hidden meaning. He began to realize how much he had lived on autopilot, surrounded by conventions, fears disguised as routine, and decisions driven by insecurities he pretended not to have. The forgotten love had left scars that shaped his existence without him realizing it. The prolonged silence, the shallow relationships, the fear of letting go, everything made sense now. He began to reread his own life through new lenses, seeing where the absence of true love had infiltrated. This required courage, because there is a specific pain in acknowledging what we lose by unconscious choice. But there was also there a seed of hope. The hope of being able to write the next chapters with more truth, more initiative, more power of choice. Amidst this silent transformation, William began to revisit places from his youth. He went to the park where he used to walk on Sundays, to the old downtown diner where he shared laughs and plans that never came to be. Each place triggered a memory, and each memory opened a different wound, but curiously also healed another. He understood that mourning his lost love was not just for the woman herself, but for the man he stopped being when he forgot who she was. The pain was real, but also revealing. And in this process of looking back without victimization, William began to reclaim parts of himself he thought were lost. His sensitivity, his generosity, his sense of purpose. He realized that the past can be a burden when we refuse to feel it, but becomes wisdom when we choose to embrace it. There, a new form of love was born, no longer attached to what was, but committed to what can still be experienced with more humanity, understanding, and altruism. It was then that William faced a choice many avoid until the end of their lives: reopen the door to memory once and for all, or seal it forever. The first path was risky, requiring resilience, forgiveness, and the courage to begin again. The second was comfortable, but costly, the price of stagnation. He knew that letting his memory fade meant burying the most sincere part of himself. And as difficult as it was, there was a spark of inspiration there. After all, only those who have the courage to carry with them what shaped them move forward. William decided not to forget. Not out of attachment, but out of respect. Because there are stories that, even painful ones, restore us to our best selves. What we do with these stories defines who we choose to be from now on. And by firmly turning that page, William wasn't erasing the past. He was converting it into light, humility, wisdom. The kind of wisdom that only arises when we stop running away and begin to embrace even that which scares us. And at this point in the journey, something much greater still awaited him. On the night everything fell silent, William sat by the window with the old photograph in his hands. Outside, the wind blew as if sweeping away the centuries. The shadow hadn't returned since the confrontation, but its presence still echoed in every thought. He knew that some presences don't need a body to continue existing. They settle in memories, decisions, gestures. And there, in that moment of introspection, William understood something greater. It wasn't just about reuniting with someone he loved, but about reuniting with who he could have been if he hadn't distanced himself. Love, even forgotten, had left traces of wisdom, sincerity, and emotional intelligence. Time hadn't taken everything. In some mysterious way, it had returned. And that's precisely what connects us to life's great transformations, the idea that what is true always finds a way to return. He decided to write everything down. Every memory, every feeling, every word that had never been spoken. Not to publish, not to seek validation, but to organize his own heart. And as he wrote, William realized that the shadow, which had once frightened him, now guided him. It was as if it had become a part of him, no longer a ghost, but a conscience. And as he reread his own words, he discovered that pain had become poetry, that loneliness had given way to compassion, that the past, with all its silences, was now a source of inspiration. He began to see others with more empathy, to listen with more affection, to smile with more authenticity. Because those who visit the shadows of their own history and return whole, return with more humanity. And those who embrace their flaws transform shame into power. William now understood that forgetting was not the solution. The true solution lay in integration. Time, that invisible sculptor, had done its part. But the next step was his. The photograph, already worn, now sat framed on the shelf. Not as a relic, but as a reminder. And the shadow? She sometimes appeared in his dreams. Not with fear, but with tenderness. Like someone watching from afar, pleased to be remembered. William had made peace with his lost love. And in doing so, he had found his own self-love, his perseverance, his intelligence, his capacity for overcoming. He knew the story didn't end there, because when we accept memory as part of who we are, the past ceases to be a prison and becomes a bridge. And if there's one thing time doesn't erase, it's the power of reconciliation. But amidst all this, something still troubled him. A new clue, a new whisper, a new call. Because when we're ready to remember, the universe begins to reveal more than we imagined. One afternoon, while cleaning the basement of his family's old house, William found a small box hidden under loose floorboards. Inside was an old diary, its cover hard and cracked by time, with a broken lock and dust marks that seemed to guard. Buried secrets. Opening the notebook, he felt a shiver, not of fear, but of recognition. The pages were filled with words written with passion, anger, and longing. There were torn passages, torn pages, sentences interrupted by dried tears. The handwriting was delicate, intense, deeply intimate. Each line carried not only memories, but traces of a love lived with courage and honesty. William felt as if he were reading letters left for him, even without his name being directly mentioned. On one of the last pages, still intact, a sentence made him shiver. "Promise me not to forget me, even if the world tries." It was more than a sentence. It was a pact. Reading the diary became routine. William read it as if conversing with a ghost that no longer frightens, but guides. Between the lines, he began to piece together the puzzle of a forbidden love story, lived under judgment, family pressure, and fear of the unknown. The voice narrating those pages spoke with love, but also with pain, the pain of someone left behind. Not out of lack of love, but out of cowardice. It was a story of choices that shaped lives, of promises made in youth, and broken by the rigidity of a compassionless society. William didn't know if he was the original recipient of those words, but he felt the message was for him now. As if the past had waited for the right time to be heard. And in the process, he learned something valuable. Memories may fade, but true emotions endure. They wait patiently, with perseverance, until someone has the sensitivity to listen to them with an open heart. Determined to preserve that story, William began rewriting the damaged pages, filling the gaps with what he felt in his soul. Not out of vanity, but out of gratitude. Gratitude for the opportunity to hear a voice that time had nearly silenced. He knew he was doing something rare. He was practicing true empathy, contributing to a narrative that wasn't just his, but that of everyone who had ever loved in silence. Each word recovered was a gesture of reparation. Each sentence reconstructed was an act of forgiveness for her, for himself, for the past. The diary wasn't just an old object. It was a symbol of reconnection, of emotional intelligence, of humanity in its purest form. And as he rewrote, he felt the shadow calm down, as if it were smiling, satisfied, for the first time in decades. But the silence of the house still hid something, because some memories, even reconstructed, still hold one last missing piece. William returned to the house where it all began. Not the house where he found the photograph or the diary, but her house. An old building, far from the city, surrounded by twisted trees that seemed to maintain a pact with silence. As he passed through the rusty iron gate, he felt something words couldn't capture, as if the house breathed, as if it knew he was there. The air was thick, and time seemed to have stopped. The place wasn't abandoned, but it wasn't alive either. It was as if it had been waiting for years for this reunion. Inside the house, each room seemed to hold a piece of history. A crooked painting on the wall, a forgotten cup on the sideboard, an old radio that turned on by itself, playing music that made him close his eyes. William didn't rationally understand what was happening, but he felt it. The house was more than a setting. It was a witness. It was a guardian. And in that space, the past wasn't a memory, it was a presence. A listening presence. He began to explore the rooms calmly, as if walking through a temple. The attic still held boxes of letters, fabrics, and newspaper clippings. The kitchen smelled of stale coffee, and the master bedroom had a pencil-marked book on the nightstand, filled with notes in the margins, words like hope, affection, trust, a new beginning. It was as if she had left small traces, crumbs of emotion scattered for anyone brave enough to follow. And William, touching these objects, felt not only nostalgia, but a kind of energetic reconciliation. The house didn't reject him. On the contrary, it collaborated. With each corner explored, another memory surfaced. He remembered conversations, jokes, silent tears in the hallway. And more than that, he remembered how she made him laugh. How she looked at him with sincerity. How she gave him the courage to be who he was, even before he knew who was. And that's the power of kindness, planting seeds that bloom long after goodbye. In one of the basement closets, he found a dress carefully hung, her perfume still lingering in the fabric. Beside it, a still working music box. The melody played, and William broke down. He cried as if cleansing his soul, as if he no longer needed to pretend everything was okay. Because sometimes, the greatest act of strength is allowing yourself to feel everything. The fear, the longing, the guilt, the love. The house seemed to respond with every creak, with every shadow cast on the wall. It was as if saying, "She heard you. Now you listen too." And he listened. Not with his ears, but with his memory, with his heart, with everything that had been silent for too long. There, in that moment, he understood that there are places that aren't made of wood and concrete. They are made of emotions. And these houses, even when they fall asleep, continue to listen. Because pain doesn't dictate the end of a story. Forgetting does, and William was no longer willing to forget. But what he didn't yet know was that her name, the most important of all, was yet to come. Back in her attic, his eyes still moist and his chest torn by a mixture of longing and revelation, William stared at a notebook with nearly illegible pages. Inside, excerpts of poems, scribbles of floral designs, loose dates, and unsigned declarations of love. Everything pointed to who she was. Everything pointed to a life shared intensely. But there was one detail that consumed him. He couldn't remember her name. The woman who had shaped his deepest feelings, who had indelibly marked his life, remained nameless. William felt torn by this. Not out of vanity, but out of compassion. Because forgetting the name of the one you love is like losing a part of your own soul. And amidst his despair, a question echoed in his mind. What does memory do with what the soul refuses to lose? The missing name wasn't just a forgetfulness. It was a trauma, a wound hidden beneath layers of psychic protection. And he knew that. Only forgiveness for having tried to erase it, for having failed to remember it, could heal. He sought help in everything he could. Old photos, hospital files, city records. No results. And that's when he realized perhaps it wasn't his mind that was blocking the name, but his heart that wasn't yet ready to speak it. And this realization hurt more than any absence. Because deep down, it was a form of self-protection. William had unconsciously chosen to forget her name so he wouldn't have to relive the pain of loss. But now, he wanted it. He needed to remember. And as he walked through the city with this emptiness, he began to realize how much names define our relationship with the world. To name is to acknowledge. It is to validate. It is to transform a feeling into something tangible. And the absence of that name generated an almost metaphysical anguish, like loving a star whose light you see, but whose name time has erased. And even in this emptiness, he remained steadfast. Because he had learned, with humility, that emotional perseverance is the bridge between what we forget and what we can still recover. One gray afternoon, sitting on a park bench, William was approached by a white-haired man with a kind gaze. "Aren't you the boy from the house on Windy Hill?" he asked in a soft accent. William nodded. The man then smiled lightly and said, "I remember you and her. You used to come here often. Her name was Eleanor, wasn't it?" And in that moment, everything stopped. That name, Eleanor, slammed into his chest like silent thunder. That was it. The missing word, the final piece of the puzzle. William closed his eyes and saw her whole, laughing, dancing in the rain, whispering secrets in the dark. Eleanor. The name had taste, color, temperature, and above all, power. The power of remembrance, of redemption, of reconciliation. William thanked her with a sincere handshake, his eyes brimming with tears. And he knew then that the next stage of his journey wouldn't just be about her, but about what he would choose to do now with all that had been restored. Because when a name returns, life returns with it. With Meg's name echoing like a gentle mantra in his mind, William began to experience something strange, almost mystical. The days were no longer just days. He began to notice small lapses in time, as if for brief seconds he were simultaneously living two realities, the one he had always known and another, old but deeply familiar. When he opened a door, he would see Meg sitting at a table for a moment. When he crossed the street, he felt her hand clasped in his. It wasn't delirium. It was as if the memories now lived alongside him, not as a weight, but as a presence. Meg was no longer just a memory or a shadow. She was an active part of his journey. And this phenomenon, though challenging, made him feel more whole, more present. The line between past and present, between grief and love, between longing and acceptance, began to dissolve. And William realized that this, deep down, was life at its most honest, a constant dance between what was and what could still be. These visions came not as chaotic hallucinations, but as precise messages. In one vivid dream, Meg guided him down a tree-lined road. In the background, familiar music played, and in the sky, constellations seemed to whisper ancient truths. In another, she simply smiled and said, "You are not alone." These experiences brought not fear, but comfort. It was as if Meg were, in fact, showing him the path to follow. Not to reclaim what had been lost, but to integrate what had been with what he now was. William understood that Meg had never been just a memory erased by pain. She was a symbol of everything he had ignored in himself: sensitivity, deep love, creativity, vulnerability, faith. This reconnection led him to practical changes. He began writing again. He resumed photography. He participated in social projects. He began talking more to strangers, smiling for no reason. Because when you understand that love is greater than time, life begins to unfold with more truth. During a walk along a country road, they used to walk together. William saw a child running and smiling, wearing the same red ribbon Meg wore when she was young. The scene, so simple, awakened a stunning realization in him. Meg hadn't returned to take him back to the past, but to return him to the present with greater awareness. This wasn't a ghost, it was a revelation, a reconciliation with his own destiny. And in that instant, he knew he needed to move forward, not as one who forgets, but as one who honors. Meg was now a part of him, like a silent compass, like a spark of eternal love tattooed on his soul. And this didn't make him weak, but more whole. He had crossed the bridge between shadow and memory. And on the other side, there was a new horizon. But before setting out for the new, he knew he needed to close the cycle. And the cycle, he felt, would only end with a definitive gesture. Something that would record the reunion and seal, with dignity and courage, the love that had survived oblivion. The next morning, William woke with a clear decision. It wasn't just any decision. It was a gesture of closure, not like closing a book to forget, but like sealing a letter with love and respect. He readied his old analog camera, the same one he'd used in his youth, and set off for a field on the outskirts of town, a place where the sky was wider and the silence seemed to listen. He took with him Meg's diary, the faded photograph, and an empty frame. He knew what he had to do: capture the moment when the past would cease to be shadow and become light. He set up the tripod, adjusted the focus, and without expecting perfection, pressed the self-timer. When he stepped back in front of the lens, he felt something strange, as if someone were beside him. And he wasn't alone. When he developed the film days later, the image appeared. William standing, staring at the horizon. And in the background, almost imperceptible, a female silhouette, smiling. It wasn't a montage. It wasn't an illusion. It was the last photograph. He framed the image and placed it in the center of the room. Not as a melancholic memory, but as a symbol of overcoming, of emotional intelligence, of reconciliation. That photo represented everything he had experienced, lost, and somehow miraculously recovered. Meg was now part of his story, consciously, cleanly, without guilt. The pain still existed, but it had taken on a new meaning. It was no longer a prison, but a portal. To each visitor who asked about the image, William told the story not with sadness, but with wisdom. He spoke of love, loss, memory, and the power we have to transform shadow into affection, regret into forgiveness, absence into symbolic presence. It was his way of giving back, of inspiring, of offering people a reminder that even what we think is lost can be found again, if we have the courage to look within with kindness and truth. The house now had light. And William finally too. The last photograph wasn't just of him with Meg, it was of him with his own humanity. Proof that even interrupted stories can be honored, that hope survives scars. That love, when true, doesn't depend on time or space. It transcends. William now walked lightly with the serene gaze of someone who has cried all he needed to and laughed back with his soul. As he left home to walk the streets, he carried in his pocket only a note, written in his handwriting. Remembering is an act of courage. Because he knew that life would go on not perfectly, not without pain, but with much more wisdom. And perhaps somewhere in time, Meg would also be smiling, proud. After all, she hadn't been forgotten. And William, now whole, was ready for what life still had to offer. And now that you've seen it all, tell me, how many parts of yourself have you been leaving dormant, waiting for someone or something to awaken them? How many names have you erased from your memory, thinking forgetting was safer than feeling? William tried to move on as if he'd never loved, but true love doesn't disappear. It's silent. It waits. And one day, it returns. How many times have you pretended you were fine just to avoid facing what really hurt? How many decisions have you made out of fear rather than truth? What could still be living inside, waiting for your courage to remember? William's story isn't just about reuniting with a love. It's about reuniting with himself. And maybe with yourself too. If this story touched you, don't ignore that discomfort. Use it. Transform it. Remember, there's no overcoming without reconciliation. There is no true love without listening, empathy, and the courage to return to where it all began. And if you also feel like you carry a shadow within you, maybe it's time to look at it with respect. Maybe it's time to feel everything you tried to forget, because only when we remember do we begin to truly live. Leave a comment. What memory have you been avoiding? And if this video touched you in any way, like it, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications. Here, every week, we bring you stories that awaken what the world has taught us to sleep.